in program.
Hello. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Sustainable Solutions lectures. This is an initiative supported by numerous organizations, and I would like to acknowledge our partners before introducing our speaker. This initiative is an initiative of the UMass University of Massachusetts system, supported by the campuses of UMass Amherst, UMass Boston, UMass Dartmouth, UMass Lowell. And in particular, we received the support of the School of Earth and Sustainability at UMass Amherst, the School of Public Policy, the School for the Environment at UMass Boston, the RIST Institute at UMass Lowell, the Sustainable Solutions Lab, the Stone Living Lab, and also, and this is an international partner from Europe, the Naturance Project, which is a consortium of universities in Europe focused on investigating innovative financing strategies for nature-based solutions. Today, we have the pleasure to have here with us Timon McPhearson. Before I leave the floor to Timon, I would like to just mention a couple of things about this lecture series. The goal of the lecture series is to create a community of expert scholars that focus on innovative strategies to enhance resilience and promote socioeconomic and environmental well-being. We hope that with this lecture series will promote collaborations, research collaborations, but also possibly cross-sectoral sectoral collaborations and partnerships between the private sector, the public sector, and academia. I would like to, I'm going to stop sharing and now introduce our speaker, Timon. I'm going to pin Timon so everybody can see him. Timon is a professor at of urban ecology and director of Urban Systems Lab at the New School. He has numerous titles. He's prolific author. I'm a huge fan of his work. In order to leave space for his talk, I'm going to include his full bio in the chat, and I'm going to leave the floor to Timon, who can now share his screen.
Great, thanks, Marta. It's really a pleasure to be here, everyone. Thank you so much for the kind invitation to talk to you in the context of the Sustainable Solutions Lecture Series. It seems like you've got an incredible group and a really nice network, not only within the UMass sort of local regional, but globally as well. So Marta, I've been a fan of your work for a long time. So like I said, it's really a pleasure to be here. Let me share screen, make sure this is working okay. Is this full screen?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, great. So as Marta introduced and mentioned, I think hopefully this talk will fit well into the lecture series on sustainable solutions. Nature-based solutions is sort of the core focus of what I want to talk about today. And as you probably know, and if not, you'll get a bit of an introduction to this, nature-based solutions have really emerged as a critical type of sustainability solution, and not only in cities, globally, in lots of different contexts. I think we could talk about a number of ways that they're already being employed, but I want to focus this talk on these questions around equity and to some extent social and environmental justice, and how that intersects with the way in which nature-based solutions are being planned, designed, included in policy, implemented, or even evaluated and or monitored. So the context here, just to kind of get us going, is that the nature-based solutions are emerging very rapidly as a sort of cornerstone of solutions in the sustainability space. I would argue in the resilience space, in the health space, in the climate adaptation and mitigation space. A couple examples of this are the ways in which of the top 5 major recommendations coming out of the IPCC in the last assessment of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, nature-based solutions were seen and put forward as one of the key strategies for dealing with both climate adaptation and mitigation. In the National Climate Assessment in the United States context, nature-based solutions has emerged really rapidly in the last couple assessments, especially in the most recent one, NCA 5, where we see that discussions of nature, ecosystems, species, the actual word nature-based solutions is emerged as a dominant way of talking about the intersection between nature and climate and people. That said, there's a few things I want to kind of cover. So this is just a quick overview of the talk, and I'll move through each of these relatively swiftly as a way to save time for discussion. So see this talk more as seeding some hopefully interesting dot points and particular studies as examples to generate a discussion. So I really look forward to talking to all of you. So you'll see this as I go through, talking a bit about the challenges, some of the dominant critiques of nature-based solutions, and then diving into a few examples from our work in New York City, some of our work nationally, and some of our work globally, and some of the insights that are coming out of the work at those scales. Now, given the sort of framing that I started with as the way nature-based solutions are rapidly emerging as a key form of dealing with a number of crises, a number of challenges, it may seem strange that we still need to make the case for greening cities, to make them more livable, to make them healthier, to make them even more equitable. But in fact, we do. There's quite a bit of debate out there about our future, about futures in general, and even pushback on whether greening is actually a positive thing for cities. And so this is just an example of some ways that in some cases, these critiques I've personally pushed back on very vociferously in this particular article. But also some critiques that I think are really important to take up and deal with. For example, in some of the ways that nature-based solutions in some cases are not addressing fundamental urban inequities of many kinds. So I'll talk some more about that in a few minutes. But just to kind of set this up in terms of some of these intersecting challenges, and just to get us all perhaps on the same page of what we're talking about when we're talking about solutions to what. One of the key solutions is really thinking about the biodiversity crisis and that is happening globally, but the importance of our attitudes, our relationship with cities, and the way in which we develop the dominant place where people live, and how that is or is not intentionally involving nature in some form. And a recent report from the World Economic Forum shows that if you look at the 500 most populous cities, just a little over a third of them have some kind of strategy that's dedicated to nature. So there seems to be a lot of work to do just to re-emphasize the importance of integrating nature into our daily lives and into and even the economies of the development paradigm that dominates the planet. As I would argue, we're living on an urban planet. We've got serious health challenges at all scales. We could argue this in both urban and rural contexts and the spaces in between. But if you look at the SDGs, and a recent report from the World Health Organization that just came out last year shows that there's not a single one of the numerical targets on health for the SDGs that are actually on track. And I'm mentioning this because these are some of the challenges that nature-based solutions are proposed and even designed, implemented, financed in order to address them. A third, and we could go on, I'm not going to actually dive into the climate challenge because I suspect many of you are quite familiar with it, but I will invoke it a little bit later. But it's also this point that I alluded to, especially in urban environments where people are seem to be perhaps more in this generation than previous generations. We could argue about that, but increasingly disconnected from nature. And one of the series of studies that have been put forth around this is to argue that the increasing the dominance of these little devices that we tend to carry in our hands all day long and look at quite often is taking the place of interaction with nature. And this has a lot of really, I think, potential implications, one of which, and I wouldn't put all this necessarily on phones or devices, but I would argue that the long-standing urban development paradigm, really since post-World War II in the 50s, that has dominated urban development all around the world. The sort of Western style of paving over nature in cities is one that has intentionally, and even when unintentionally, increasingly separated people who live, grow up, are born and die in cities, and separating them from nature. And I think this has massive implications, given that cities are where the money to be spent on biodiversity conservation is. It's where the decision making happens. It's where the political leadership is. It's the dominant drivers of innovation on the planet. And so it's interesting to think about what that means in terms of future innovation, future decision making, if we have a paradigm where we're increasingly disconnected from nature. So again, I think this is one of the fundamental challenges about how to reconnect people to the biosphere. And Marta asked me to give a few examples of how nature-based solutions can be effective, or where the case has been empirically made for seeing nature as actually addressing these challenges. And I'm going to instead point to a few resources that folks can look at and dig in much deeper, because I'm going to switch after this and really focus on some of these equity dimensions. But I'll just mention one around mental health. And so some of my colleagues, and I'll mention some of Nadia Kabish's work and Greg Batman's work around this, have really looked at the connection between nature-based solutions and mental health. And I'll come back to this later in our recent book, Nature-Based Solutions for Cities. In one of the chapters, they really look at what is the empirical studies that are showing the ways in which spending time, whether sitting or walking or even hanging out in parks of very different kinds, different sizes, different amounts of time, can have positive psychological impacts, positive mental health impacts. So this is just one type of challenge, the mental health challenge. And again, we could kind of point to what has been described as an epidemic of mental health challenges in the United States since the pandemic. One could argue that one of the ways that we would address this, and I would argue this, is to reinvest in nature as a way of decreasing the anxiety and stress and other types of challenges we deal with from a mental perspective. And that's just one example. We can go into many more. Nature-based solutions then have been put forward as a way, and there's various definitions around this, but as a way of investing in nature as a solution space. And I use this example from the Nature Conservancy of a tree, and that those previous slides around the key challenges to say that one of the core benefits of nature-based solutions of various kinds, whether it's investments in green infrastructure, or managing for biodiversity, or conservation, restoration approaches, that these can actually address multiple challenges simultaneously. I think if we boil down the key added value, multiple types of benefits of nature to sort of one sentence, it tends to be that that nature is multifunctional. It can solve multiple problems simultaneously. It doesn't mean it always does. We have to manage for that and be careful about that. But this perhaps is a good example of the way in which trees have impacts on recreational opportunities, can actually be documented as being connected to reducing obesity levels and other types of physical health, mental health, as I mentioned, as well, but also for biodiversity, for climate, and even for the economy. Now, there's multiple types of nature-based solutions, again, just to get us on the same page and to say that these span not only as my work is focused in the urban context, but beyond the urban and even the peri-urban and agriculture, conserved areas, rural spaces, et cetera. And we could see that there's multiple types of ecosystems, of green infrastructure, of various types of investments in nature that one could argue are solving some mix of those problems, depending on how they're being managed, restored, or conserved. But just to challenge all of this a little bit further, I want to kind of remind us that not all of our cities look like Boston or Cambridge, not all of our cities look like New York, that the urban space around the planet is very complicated in a lot of ways. And one of the ways you might think about this when we think of, why don't we green our cities? Why don't we invest in nature to solve all of these problems? Is that it may be simple on the surface, but it's not simple if you dig below the surface even a little bit. And I would argue that our cities are complicated. They're also complex systems. And I mean that in some ways in a mathematical sense, that they're really complex with many, many types of interactions that are happening simultaneously in real time that make it challenging to ensure that any type of investment, whether it's a nature-based investment or others, will really meet the goals and be sustainable over the long term. Our cities are increasingly connected, so investments in one neighborhood may have positive or negative impacts on another neighborhood. So they're internally connected, but they're also connected to each other. So what we, and I think we're seeing this in the economic context right now, is the hyper connectivity between what happens in some locations impacts other locations. And we see that these are also increasingly congested and contested spaces. So I mention this because I think it's important for us to think about the real life variable context of urban life on the planet in the context of thinking about how we invest in nature. Nature-based solutions has been contested as a term, as a concept, and even as a strategy. And I bring this up because I think it's an important backdrop to really thinking and diving in now more around the questions of how can we improve equity and justice in cities, and where is the opportunity space for nature-based solutions to be on the positive side of that, rather than on the negative side. In the Kunming Montreal negotiations and at COP15 just a couple of years ago, they were leading up to the Global Biodiversity Framework. You may be familiar with this. The term nature-based solutions was really hotly contested. This was actually contested, and eventually there was consensus within the IPCC, but we see this as still going on within the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, within the UN CBD, and a number of the global policy spheres. Nature-based solutions is contested for a number of reasons. And some of these are coming strongly from indigenous networks and indigenous communities, but also broadly across the global South, that sees nature-based solutions, one, as a dominantly Western concept, one that is easily commodified. And so we can relate this back to other terms that have been used, whether it's ecosystem services, nature's contributions to people, or many other types of terms that are out there. But one, the solutions part of this language is often contested because there's a open question, and I'll dive into this a little bit more, around solutions for whom. Are they really solutions? If they don't benefit everyone, are they inclusive? Again, as I mentioned, because it's in some ways it can be easily commodified, and this can lead into things like greed washing. One of the issues around financing for nature, and Marta, I know you mentioned the connection between nature and finance and some of the work. I think one of the open questions there really is, how can we leverage private capital? This seems to be a huge question that's happening from the World Economic Forum to global policy forums to national forums, all the way down to our cities, which is how do we find the capital to really invest in nature in a positive way? And yet there's strong concern around how that might open up the space for actually decreasing inclusive processes or having negative impacts on particular communities, and not only indigenous communities, immigrant communities, minority communities, low-income communities, and many others. And even a pushback from some of these communities has been around that this can facilitate other colonial type practices of exploitation, land taking, and other types of practices. So there's a very, and I'm putting this out here not just to say there's strong pushback out there, but that actually these are very important for us to engage with. While anyone who might know some of my work would know that I've been a strong proponent of investing in nature-based solutions as a strategy for us to unite work around solving the biodiversity crisis, the climate crisis, and other types of crises related to inequality. So I'm going to frame it like this, and then we'll dive into some of the examples I mentioned and move to the next section. A challenge that we've identified in an upcoming paper, hopefully this will be out next month. There's a special feature in PNAS, the journal PNAS, that is on urban nature-based solutions, and we're hoping that all the papers associated with that will come out quite soon. So I'm going to feature a couple things as a bit of a prelude, and just to say, look out for these papers. So it's a little bit early, but they are impressed nonetheless. And one of the things that we identified in this paper that's led by my colleague Nikki Franziskaki in the Netherlands has been that there's a core challenge. If we were to highlight the core challenges that really remain in investing in nature-based solutions as a way of getting to more just urban transformations. And this challenge we frame as the inclusivity, equity, and justice challenge. And there's a little bit of a text on this slide, but I won't read it all for you, but just to say that this summarizes some of the points I've been making around adoption of NBS can reinforce social inequality. It can actually, and there's quite a bit of work over the last 5 to 10 years that have framed this around this term green gentrification, but it can also cause displacement and really further exclude historically marginalized groups. It doesn't necessarily always have to be that way, but we're seeing increasing examples where that is happening. So this is a major concern, and rightfully so. Communities and others are pushing back on this concept because this is happening. On the other hand, it can provide many types of benefits, but sometimes those benefits provide benefits for some urban dwellers and not others, or create burdens. So one of the things we've seen in a lot of cities in the US, in Philadelphia and Baltimore and New York, is that investments in green infrastructure for stormwater regulation to absorb stormwater in the city. This is one of the dominant ways that cities are trying to comply with the Clean Water Act in the United States, and working with the EPA regulations around this has been to invest in green infrastructure as a stormwater regulatory mechanism. And yet they're easily clogged. They tend to be places where trash can accumulate. They don't necessarily work if they're not being managed. And a lot of places in the cities that I just mentioned, that management is falling on local neighborhoods, often in low income and minority neighborhoods, who are left with the burden of whether or not these things are actually performing as they're intended. There's a number of concerns around equity and justice and fairness, and I'll just mention ones that tend to come up pretty regularly. One is around the distribution of both burdens, as I just mentioned, with that one example, but also benefits. Also the opportunity for being involved in the decision-making process, and not only decision-making, but in the implementation, job creation, workforce development, et cetera, as well as in the recognition and knowledge and value of the different identities and knowledges involved. And so these are just some areas that we point out. I'm being kind of broad here, but I want to dive into some specifics now in a moment. So I wanted to bring you back to the town that I work in New York, and give you a little bit of examples of what some of our empirical work has shown in terms of these questions around investments in green infrastructure as a form of a nature-based solution, and what that looks like in terms of equity. So I'm going to show you a couple complicated maps. And again, this is just to show you a little bit of what some of these issues look like from first this distributional perspective in New York City. And what you're looking at here is a kind of complicated analysis of a range of nature-based solutions for local temperature regulation, for stormwater runoff mitigation. So across the top row is temperature regulation. So think of this as cooling, the ability of green vegetation to provide cooling in the city. And on the bottom is the potential for runoff mitigation from vegetative spaces in the city. On the left, we see this analysis for where we have variation in the supply of that benefit. In the middle is where we see spatial variation in what we're describing as the demand, the social demand, basically who needs it based on a number of social demographic factors and access or lack of access to those benefits. And on the right is just a simple spatial mismatch of where you see high demand and low supply in the red. Now I'm going to zoom in a little bit just to make this a little more clear. If you do a spatial hotspot analysis of this, and we really look where are these areas standing out, in red is where we see the strongest mismatch. And what I mean by that is where we have the highest demand and the lowest supply. Now, one of the sort of complicating factors here is that population size matters. And so where we have dense populations, we have more demand. So it's not simply, and there's a number of indicators involved in this, like low income, race, ethnicity, and other factors that are involved in this supply, or sorry, this demand analysis, but as well as population density. If you take that out, you see different patterns, but either way, some of these patterns show up very strongly, like in the South Bronx that I have in circles here, regardless of whether population density is there or not. You see high demand, low supply. Basically, low income minority neighborhoods have less of the benefit than some of the other neighborhoods in the city. So this is just an example of some of the ways that this work has been looked at, not only in New York, but in places around the world, to show the distributional inequities of who benefits from, in this case, green infrastructure that's being designed to serve multiple type of benefits. This is a similar map-ish, except the green dots are looking at the area of green roofs in New York. It's a couple years old now. I know our database for green roofs is expanding, so there's a few more dots that should be in here. But nonetheless, what you see is, and without even looking at the red, if you just look at the green dots, you see a concentration of green roofs that are invested largely in Manhattan. If you know the Manhattan space, I don't know if you can see my cursor. No, it's not showing up. If you're familiar with this, on the sort of left and middle of this sort of zoom in to New York City is the island of Manhattan, and the concentrated area of green dots is in Midtown and Lower Manhattan. And where you see there's a few exceptions to this, but a very small number ultimately of exceptions. You see a lot of this is along the waterfront. And one of the dominant investments in green roofs, which have been touted, and including from me, as a potential space where we can really create new habitat for biodiversity. We can help absorb stormwater locally and really limit the amount of runoff on the streets. We have the opportunity to cool buildings, reduce energy costs. There's so many benefits from green roofs, and yet we see that they're largely happening in high-rise luxury condos as amenities for basically wealthy residents or just wealthy owners of apartments. So there's a huge inequity in terms of who benefits, and you can see in the red, the proportion of the population living below the poverty line just helps to emphasize that some of these benefits that you might have from these investments in green space are clearly not benefiting everyone equally. I'm gonna look at a similar thing nationally. So we could talk about other things that are happening in New York, and it could give other examples. So I'm happy to come back to this in discussion, but I want to look at some recent study that came out a couple years ago that we did doing some similar work during the COVID pandemic around access to green space nationally. This is an analysis of over 5,000 cities and towns in the United States. And we were doing two things. I'm going to focus less on the COVID case. There's a lot of interesting things to talk about in terms of COVID case rates. But one of the things that I think you can see really clearly on the y-axis in panels, on the first panel and the third panel, panel B and D, is a measure of greenness using NDVI. In C and E is looking at parks and the area and size of parks. And essentially what you see if you look along the bottom rows, and I'll just go kind of steadily through this really briefly, is in the far left, when you look at both race and ethnicity, you see that essentially people of color that identified from the US Census as people of self-identified as people of color have lower access to parks and less green space in their neighborhood. If you look at the far right, you see that this maps onto income inequality as well. That essentially lower income neighborhoods are less green and lower income neighborhoods have less parks. And these are statistically significant. And this is a national pattern, right? So the things I showed you in New York, one could say, well, New York's doing really terrible. But if you look at this nationally, we could say, no, that actually this is a problem for the entire country. There's other studies that have been looking at this globally, and we see this is a problem globally, right? So there's some fundamental challenges around equity, and I'm really focusing from the work that we've done recently around some of these distributional inequities. But as I mentioned before, when we look more broadly at the literature, other types of inequities, recognitional inequity, and others are really popping out. I'm going to show you another national study. This is US, again, before we move global. And I'm going to try to move a little bit faster because I think I've been talking slower than I normally do. Just so we have plenty of time for discussion, is a question that we asked in a multi-year study called, is green infrastructure a universal good? A different way of framing the same question, meaning who benefits and who does it. If you're interested in this, you can look at giequity.org, which summarizes all of this work. So this is just a screenshot. We looked at 20 different cities, and the core part of this project was we chose 20 cities that range across the US in various sizes, so not just large cities, medium-sized cities in different parts of the country. And then we gathered over 300 plans from these cities that were sustainability plans, adaptation plans, green infrastructure plans, any plan that we thought might have something to say about green infrastructure. And then we reduced that down to 120 plans. And this is before AI and LLMs became a more useful tool for this type of analysis. So this took us multiple years, but we deeply coded thousands of pages across 122 city plans across 20 cities to ask the question, how are these plans defining green infrastructure? How are they assessing, how are they dealing with equity, if at all? And across this massive analysis, and there's multiple papers here that you can check out that have come out of this so far, and there's still, this data set is so massive that there's still more papers coming. We largely found that the planning environment, so if you look at urban planning in the United States, urban planning for green infrastructure largely fails to consider equity. Many of the plans do not even define it, if they include it at all. And where they do, they often include it in a pretty cursory way. And so we looked at the way green infrastructure first, just to understand how they're treating green infrastructure, how it's conceived, the different types, the various types of functions, the way benefits are articulated. Not surprisingly, we found that a lot of this, the majority of this is focused on stormwater in cities in the United States context. And yet then we looked at the equity dimensions, and we looked at them from a distributional perspective, like the maps I just showed you in New York City, but also from a process. How did green infrastructure planning across all of these US cities involve and be inclusive in terms of their processes, both in the planning phase and the design phase and the implementation phase and the evaluation phase? And then we also looked at how their whole visioning and goal setting was approached, and whether equity was included in the way in which they define their goals and how equity and justice is conceived. And again, what really comes out of this analysis is the US has a long way to go in our urban planning for green infrastructure to take equity not just seriously as a concept or as a problem, but actually to deal with it in its multiple dimensions, from process dimensions, from distributional dimensions, from recognitional dimensions. So let's look at what we know, what's happening across both the scientific literature as well as the practice space globally. And I want to dive in a little bit to some analysis we've been doing of the state of knowledge on nature-based solutions at a global level. This is another one of these papers I mentioned that isn't quite out yet, so unfortunately you can't read it really closely, but hopefully it will be in the coming weeks. And this is an effort where we ask the question, what does the literature have to say about nature-based solutions generally? And I'm going to focus a subset of our answers here on the equity questions. But we come out of this analysis with a number of sort of synthetic statements about what the literature has to say about this. And so because nature-based solutions, as I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, has emerged so rapidly, I won't show you the graphs of how many papers have been published over the last 10 years and how that compares over the last couple of years in terms of the rapid emergence, right? We have journals called nature-based solutions now. There's this emergence of this concept and strategy has really grown at an exponential rate. And so instead of doing some kind of systematic literature review of all those papers, we've realized that so many of those systematic literature reviews have been done that this is a review of all the reviews to really say, what are all the reviews that are happening? Some reviews are national, some reviews are regional, some reviews are global. And so we conducted a review of a review analysis in a systematic way to really ask questions about how nature-based solutions are addressing a variety of challenges, knowledge challenges, social challenges, ecological challenges, and what do they have to say about the opportunity space for this. Then we paired that analysis of over 60 review papers that we reviewed by forming a series of expert groups in 7 major global regions, where we asked known experts on nature-based solutions in those regions to bring forward case studies, to look at the literature in their region, and to synthesize what the state of knowledge on nature-based solutions is in those regions. And we put those 2 bits of analysis together. So I'm going to show you as the sort of culmination of this massive review effort alongside this expert input assessment on key insights for one, what are the core challenges that remain for really investing in nature as a way to solve the multitude of challenges we talked about at the beginning of the talk, as well as and that opportunity space as well. So these are some of the prompts that we asked our experts in terms of really asking some questions. And some of this isn't about equity, it's about other questions we have about the role of nature-based solutions. For example, how important is the ecological context for nature-based solutions to be effective? And we find, oh, it's very important. What are some of the diverse and dominant NBS types in your region? Like, how is that vary regionally around the world? And we pulled this together into a global synthesis. So out of this comes what we synthesized into 8 key challenges and 5 major insights that develop some pathways forward. And it kind of looks like this. It's a little bit complicated, but this was a relatively big effort. There's a lot of authors on this paper. A lot of really amazing people contributed to this, as well as all the literature that we combed through. And I'm going to focus on one of these key challenges. So we defined 8 key challenges that are important, one even conceptual. How is nature-based solutions conceived? Because that varies regionally around the world. And we could talk about that a little bit more. And also at the bottom on the system challenge. And then I'll summarize some of these pathways forward in a few minutes. So don't feel like you have to capture all the words on this page. And I'm getting to my last maybe 5 minutes or so of the talk. 5 key insights, as I mentioned, emerge out of this global review process. I'm going to focus on these last 2, on putting justice and equity at the center of urban nature-based solutions approaches, and the role of inclusive and participatory governance processes. These 2 really fell out when we tried to distill from all the 7 regions, from all the literature that's been written about nature-based solutions. It seems really clear that the local ecological contextual knowledge is essential, and we need multiple forms of knowledge at the table. So that already has something to say about the need for inclusivity and multiple forms of knowledge. That we also find that there's a lot of technical knowledge that's needed for NBS to be effective. And that's missing. That's insight 2. 3, that NBS is still weak when it comes to mastering comprehensive urban planning. So in the context of planning all around the world, it still isn't very strong. But these last 2 came out very strongly. And again, it varies in different regions of the world, but we still find them coming forward very strongly, regardless of the region, that it seems critical for nature-based solutions to really be effective and address the multitude of challenges that they're being proposed to address, that equity and justice have to be at the center. They have to be at the center of the planning, at the center of the design, at the center of the implementation process, and all the way through. And lastly, that includes the governance processes, and that when we look at the governance for nature-based solutions, that there's a massive need that still remains around inclusivity and more participatory processes. Obviously, these are a little bit high level, but I'm happy to give you some more examples. It would take much more time to show you all the examples from around the world that we've gathered, which is why I'll point you to a couple resources towards the end of my presentation. But I wanted to mention that there's a couple pathways that seem to emerge out of what we've synthesized in all of this knowledge. One is that there seems to be a lot of opportunity still to really innovate and to share learning. So we've been pointing to this as a way of not necessarily solving inclusivity in the process side, but certainly as a way of mobilizing the diverse forms of knowledge and using that as an approach where we can make NBS more effective. And the other pathway I wanted to emphasize in bold here is the need for a systems approach. And this will be kind of my last major point of the talk of why systems matter, why taking a systems approach matter. But we argue that it does, that for nature-based solutions to be effective, whether they're for stormwater regulation or cooling or mental health benefits or to improve recreation or to provide more habitat for biodiversity, for them to be effective, we need to really recognize that they're happening in the context of complex and complicated systems. I'm going to skip this and come back to it if we need to. And to say that the way I often try to talk about this is to say that it's systems all the way down. And this is coming back to my slide about the complexity and the complicatedness of cities. right? This is something that we really took on many years ago as a way of trying to understand the value of urban nature, and to say when we look at that, we see that there's benefits that are social, there's benefits that are ecological, there's benefits that are economic, there's benefits that are for technology and infrastructure. And yet to have those benefits, we have to involve technology, we have to involve ecosystems and make sure that they're healthy and functioning. We have to involve people. And if you leave any of these out, of these components of the complicated systems that are our cities, you'll have less effectiveness. That's sort of the operating hypothesis, and we see this more and more in studies empirically as well. I also put this slide up, this was partly for you, Marta, because if you're looking for examples of where empirical studies have documented nature-based solutions or green infrastructure in some of these cases in the urban environment as being effective, this study reviewed over 600 papers. So people often forget when they look at this study and they read the study that there's a supplementary file, and in it is a summary by benefit area of 600 papers. So it's really a massive resource, and I would point people to this if you're looking for examples, cases, other literature around that. But I want to come back to the systems point as my sort of last point, is that when we think about how our cities are. So if you look out, I don't know if you're in the city right now or where you might be, but and I don't even think it matters necessarily that you're in a city, but if you look outside your window or maybe even look around your room, we'll see that it's made up of multiple components, and these components are interacting, right? The plants right here are producing oxygen that's part of the atmosphere within my office. The light that's coming in through the window is affecting my mood. The air pressure, when we get a low pressure system, it affects my sinuses, tends to put me in a little bit of a grumpy mood, right? It affects our mental health. Our conversation is incredibly enabled by technology, by infrastructure. If you take a green roof example, right? You can't have green roofs in an urban environment with soils that can be deep enough to hold a biodiverse habitat because they're heavy and wet without serious investments in the roof infrastructure. It has to be strong. It has to be able to support heavy, wet soils, right? So the infrastructure piece can't be ignored. So the point here really is that for nature-based solutions to be effective, we have to recognize that they exist in the context of dynamically interacting social, ecological, and technological systems. In a recent paper with a number of amazing thinkers on this, co-written with Elizabeth Cook at Barnard College, we put forward some examples of when you look at ecosystem services and some of the types of nature-based solutions that are being used to produce ecosystem services for human benefit. We see that they vary in terms of their components, of how strongly the social component or the ecological component or the technological infrastructure component is needed for them to be effective. But in all cases, and there's a number of hypotheses for junior scholars out there who want some interesting questions to go test. There's a number of testable hypotheses in this paper that we put forward as a way of how to think in a systems dynamic about nature-based solutions, and some of the questions that we still have yet to answer about the potential asymmetry in the various components and how they interact in real time along that benefit chain from planning and design to implementation to actually evaluating effectiveness over longer time frames. So I'm going to finish there to say that as a larger argument, coming back to the large scale urban challenges that we're facing on the planet, in this country, in our own cities and towns, that the argument around systems isn't just for nature-based solutions. It's really to say that in order to have solutions that aren't causing unintended trade-offs or investing in sustainability and resilience one place that has a negative impact on another neighborhood or another city or adjacent towns and communities, we need to be thinking about them across space and time, but also across multiple components of systems and how they interact. This is easy to say, it's very hard to do. Our governance structures tend to be siloed. We tend to plan housing separately from the way we invest in parks, separately from the way we might think about how we transform our road infrastructure. But bringing these together, I think, is really critical as we think about more positive futures and ways we can shift the narrative away from the sort of dystopian futures that dominate a lot of the way we're thinking about future. So I want to just show you a couple resources to end and say that the conclusion I'm hoping you take home from this and take a look at some of these papers when they come out in hopefully a few weeks. I would say by end of May at the latest, that it seems very clear that there's still a really prominent social challenges facing nature-based solutions, which is really how to effectively center justice and make inclusive planning the way we do it, make it actually the norm in terms of how we plan and design and invest in nature-based solutions. And also that there is a real challenge right now that we're still facing. And I think I would argue an uphill battle in making the distribution of benefits and burdens more fair and thinking about more participatory processes where we can bring in the recognition of various voices, various knowledges, various identities, all into the process of whatever is decided invested in or not, or decided not to be invested in. So I'm going to leave you with these questions. These are some questions that come out of one of our papers that we suggest if you're a researcher, but also if you're a practitioner. These are some of the questions that I'd suggest you think about in terms of how we can make nature-based solutions if we're investing in them effective. One is to ask the what question. What particularly are we investing? What is the challenge that we're responding to? To what are the core components of nature-based solutions in terms of ecological and biodiversity features? Where are we thinking about citing? Some of those papers I mentioned from the giequity.org site and is really about citing the inequities of the way green infrastructure is cited and who's benefits and who's not benefiting from that. How do we think about various dimensions and how to invest in those? When is a good time to be doing these? It's not always the case that now is the right time. We need to be considerate of that. And then who, this fundamental question about who will benefit, who's involved, who's part of the process. So there's lots of resources out there. Our book on nature-based solutions, which has chapters from folks all around the world, I think around 100 authors contributing to this, has a lot of case studies and insights. So feel free to check this out. This is free and available to download online. And the last thing I'll mention is there's some new work that we're doing within our Natura project to take that global synthesis paper and take it much further. This is a massive effort across all the regions in the world with a number of networks, some of which you'll probably recognize here, to really develop the first global urban assessment of nature-based solutions. And we've been working on this for almost 3 years now. We plan to launch this summer with 7 regional reports, a global synthesis report, an executive summary. We'll be launching this in a number of places, including at Climate Week, but also at COP30 and others. So this is just something to kind of keep a lookout for. I'm talking a long time, so thank you so much for your attention and sticking with it. I'm looking forward to your insights.
Thank you so much, Timon. It was wonderful, as usual. I'm a big fan of your work. I'm sure there are going to be a lot of questions in the chat, but I also invite people to just raise their hand if they want to talk directly with you. Is there anybody who would like to ask questions to Timon? And I see Pakasem Tongchai. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Hello, welcome.
Yes. Hello. Yeah, thank you so much. I'm from Bangkok and it's almost midnight time. And yeah, great I'm able to join this meeting and I thought it is a great opportunity because I work on urban resilience project in Thailand. We got the funding from German ministry. And I saw that the term nature-based solution in Thailand is very new. We find it's very struggle to talk about nature-based solution vs business as usual. And then what we found is that I'm trying because I'm promised to the donor that I have to present nature-based solution. We try to do the I think because I read your paper before about the principle or the something about nature-based solution. We try to put nature-based solution in planning, but it's very hard part because as you mentioned that it's very silo system. I'm trying to put in the work that the government done, but the hard part is like they don't welcome nature-based solution much because a lot of benefits from the construction project, something like that. So I just want to ask you that, did you see any obstacle or how can you review in terms of nature-based solution in terms of Southeast Asia country? What do you see and what is you think that we can develop in terms of to push more on nature-based solution? Thank you.
Thank you so much for your question, Pakasam. And I'm totally shocked that you're still up in the middle of the night and being here. So thank you for that. It's really generous of you. I will point you to a couple things. One is this review paper that's not out yet in terms of some of the insights from Southeast Asia. And I'll also say this Natura Global Roadmap that we've been working on. We have an entire report where major sections and case studies in Southeast Asia are there. And one of the reasons for that is because there are good examples of where nature-based solutions are being involved in planning. And so I think one of your questions is, how can that happen? And one of the ways that may or may not work, depending on your local context in Bangkok and then broadly in Thailand, is to look at successful examples elsewhere and ask, how did they do it? What was that process? Was it political will of a key leader? Was it a financial argument that said, okay, these are the benefits that we can expect for whether they're climatic benefits or biodiversity benefits or human benefits? It varies around the world, and I think it even would vary within Southeast Asia in terms of what might be working in that local context. But looking at successful examples is one way where you can sort of interrogate them a little bit, especially if we have enough information about those case studies to be able to say, okay, why did it work? What was the effective mechanism, and could it work here? One of the things we're seeing in our synthesis work is not only the thing that all of you would instantly recognize is that that local context matters, but it's not always clear that even if something worked well in one context, even in the same regional context, that it's going to work in yours. It's still very experimental. I think we all have to kind of recognize that we're going to have to understand the local politics, the local financial constraints, the technical knowledge that may or may not be there as a way of arguing for this to be included in urban planning. So that variation is, I don't know that there's any way around it, but looking at some successful examples might be one way, and hopefully there's a few resources that I've shared that will be helpful there. And that's the goal of the Global Roadmap Project, is to provide resources all around the world of cases that are working, and as well as where we see challenges and how they're being overcome. Thanks for your question.
I just wanted to
Thank
mention, thank you so much. Before letting Alex from Boston Food Forest asking his question, I just wanted to mention that we are going to make the presentations available. All the presentations in the Sustainable Lecture Series are recorded. And we are also going to work on a web page with the links to the resources that are shared during each presentation, so you can access those resources more easily. Alex?
Oh, thanks. And thanks for the great presentation, Timon. I'm Alex with Boston Food Forest Coalition. We're a nature-based solution in Boston. I don't know if you're aware of what we do, but we've built 13 food forest public parks across the city. Our focus is on increasing parkland equity. There's about a 20% disparity in access to parkland due to racist practices like redlining in Boston, and about a 40% disparity in trees between mostly white and mostly black and brown neighborhoods. And so we're focused directly on that by building edible public parks with neighbors at the center of the design process and part of the maintenance and longevity of the parks or community land trust. Yeah, so I'm curious, especially in this funding climate, what you're seeing, if there's any patterns in funding trends, what funders are saying out in your world. My guess is you have access or have seen that in the different places, rooms that you're in. It'd be helpful to understand how you think about or how you're seeing effective framing of that to help move more people towards these critical solutions. As you showed in your last slide, there's two different stark outcomes, and we see that in our city, and building more parks really matters in that way for every neighborhood, and increasing mental health, all of that, food access, community connection, climate resilience is a big part of our work. And so, yeah, just curious how you're seeing, if funders are moving in a direction, what framing's working for them, how you're how you're experiencing that out in the world.
Yeah, great question, Alex. And congratulations on your work. It sounds amazing, exactly the kind of thing that's needed. And I think one of the things that I can hear in your articulation already that you're doing, which is framing the core work in multiple ways, right? So it's climate resilience work, it's environmental justice work, it's about food production in a way, even at small scale, it's about human connection to nature. I think in terms of funders, there's got to be multiple narratives to reach funders that have different objectives, but might still be interested in investing in what you're doing. So some of them will be focused on climate adaptation, resilience. Others are around food. However, really to answer your question, I'd say if you asked me this a couple months ago, I'd have a really different answer. The funding landscape has changed so dramatically, as you know, and it's not just in terms of federal funders, but the federal funding landscape has changed so much that it's really hard to make any statements about where we're headed. It seems to me so uncertain right now that and in my own group and my own network, it's unclear how to navigate it exactly in terms of what are funders looking for. I would say, though, that your group, and this is quite different for researchers, you're building things. And if we go backwards in time 6 months ago, which may not be useful now, but I would say that whether in the US context, whether this is investments from IRA funding or others, has been much more funding at all scales, federal scales, state level scales, and even the city scales for building things, right? For creating inclusive processes, for doing research, for doing monitoring and evaluation, there's really a lot less total dollars out there, regardless of what type of funder. But actually investing in a landscape, I think, puts you in a really strong place for looking at a diversity of funders out there. There's just in terms of examples that I'm thinking of, some that naturally come to mind are ones where, say, development corporations are invested in greening. And they may have, sometimes there's perverse incentives here. And this goes back to some of my earlier points, right? It may be about how to increase real estate values in an area. And so you've got to, find a way to make an argument that the areas they might be focused on are not the only areas that matter, that some of these other issues are there, but they can also see the benefit of their investments by investing in these low-income minority neighborhoods as a place to green as well. I think this hasn't come up. I'm scanning quickly through the questions in the chat and didn't see it, but it usually comes up in these talks, which is, what about displacement? What about the potential of these kinds of investments, like what you're doing in these food forests, as potentially causing displacement? And so I would argue there's another avenue for thinking about funding, which is the way in which you can connect this with other strategies, whether this is in Boston or other areas that are about affordable housing, for example. And how do you connect greening with affordable housing, which I think is increasingly needed for both reasons. One, so that affordable housing has green space associated with it and all those benefits. And also so that when we're investing in green space, we're doing it in a way that's helping deal with the housing challenge that we have, instead of it potentially increasing real estate values and actually contributing to the housing problem in a bit of a perverse way. So it's not a great answer to your question in terms of, where are the trends, because I think they've really shaken up. Even in the private foundation world, with the foundations that I interact with and program officers at different foundations, many of them are resetting their priorities and are sort of rethinking how to refocus their mission statement in response to what's happening federally, and the way in which what happens federally is going to affect things at a state level. I know we're talking to the US portion of the audience here, but I think that's something to pay attention to, and to ask the same question, not of me, but of particular foundations or program officers who can help give you, a little more direction of what they see happening. Because I do find that foundations talk to each other a lot. They're very well connected, and so they have a good sense of what's going on with their peers.
Yeah, definitely. That's a great point. We're poised to lose probably about $1 million in federal funding due to all the cuts that are going on, and so we've been trying to double down in the foundation direction and with private individuals, but it is hard to suss out because everybody's so splintered in how they talk about this work and what they see as the challenges. And for us, we're on a pathway to try to build 30 food forests by 2030. That's been our goal. And so we've, to lose $1 million of that to try to reorient folks. So just
It's terrible. Yeah.
A little bit of what kind of trends are out there. If others are seeing it or have advice, we'd love to hear it in the comments.
Yeah, I mean, the thing none of us probably want to say out loud, but I think it's true that it's going to be more competitive for a while. Because what you said, I'm hearing everyone say, which is I'm refocusing on private foundations, and then program officers are telling me there's no way we can fill the gap. So that's, I think there's sort of two thoughts I have around that. One is to really keep honing those pitches for the right places and developing the contacts and networks and asking good questions, right? It's not always to get on a call with a program officer to pitch. It's to get on and find out what are they interested in, how are they shifting? What are the things that they're looking for? What are their other colleagues? Maybe they can connect you to a different foundation if they're not the right one. And the second is for us to think about this not as a bunch of us on a call are actually all competing for the same thing, but how do we get together and collaborate? Because I think that collaboration is going to be essential for more boats to rise than whoever happens to make it through the channels. And as the funding is drying up, it's going to be tough.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks.
you.
Good luck.
Yeah.
You're doing awesome work. I'm really excited to hear what you're doing.
Framing. It's really helpful for us to have the actual numbers and the work that you've been doing, we've been following, and to hear it in such a succinct way is really beneficial to help us make the case in different avenues. So we really appreciate the work you're doing.
Thank you, Alex. And thank you, Timon, for your thoughtful answer. I'd be happy to also add in the chat resources to the European project I was mentioning before that is trying to look at innovative financing strategies for nature-based solutions in case there is interest in exploring this area further. We have another question in the chat from Riley Bartlett. How do we master the political will for MBS and similar initiatives in the US and other areas that are facing a regression from climate policies? Then maybe we can also expand this question in asking if you want, Timon, to go back also to some of your slides in discussing the enabling factors, the elements that are really able to catalyze the conceptualization and adoption of nature-based solutions.
And I was just typing in the chat another resource, not just for Alex, but others. So I lost the beginning of your question, Marta. Was it about the EU nature restoration law?
No, no, I mentioned the EU for the project that I will share later, so no worries about that. There is a question from Riley about how do we master the political will for MBS and similar initiatives in the US and other areas that are facing a regression from climate policies. And then
the big question.
If you want, you can expand also to enabling factors that you see as most successful. Maybe it's different in different regions of the world. In fact, this was one of, sorry for expanding further
go ahead.
Riley's question, but just to mention, I went super fast on your bio, which is a super fantastic bio, and I just wanted to mention that Timon is also Senior Research Fellow at the Carey Institute of Ecosystem Studies, Stockholm Resilience Center at Stockholm University, and the, I assume I pronounced it correctly, Begier Institute of Ecological Economics at the Swedish Royal Academy of Sciences. You have worked on many projects in different parts of, focusing on different parts of the world. If you have different impressions in terms of what are enabling factors and possible barriers in different parts of the world, our audience is very diverse today in terms of geographical origin. So, yeah.
Well, let's start with Riley's first part of Riley's question in terms of political will in the U.S. context. And then we can talk about other areas a little bit. And I think there's interesting things to talk about in the European context where I also work. This is a little bit related to the answer to Alex's question, but I think political will shifts around. And so we're seeing, right, this sort of we're in the middle of this massive change. I don't know, there's a lot of words we could use to describe what's happening right now at the federal level, which is being mirrored at other levels in some ways, or just trickling down or having impacts, right? It's not always mirroring or the same ideology that's driving it, but we're certainly seeing impacts that are spreading extremely fast that are probably affecting political will. But I will also say, at least in my experience, the political will changes. It can change really dramatically. And so I think one of the things that's really important is to stay the course, continue doing the work, lay the groundwork so that when those moments of opportunity open up, we can mobilize our networks, mobilize our communities, and really push forward when the opportunity is there. And those windows of opportunity come and go, right? In New York, I've worked with the city of New York through 5 mayoral administrations now, and there's been very climate progressive mayors and ones that are not. There's been ones that are really focused on nature, and others that are not. Ones that are focused on equity and ones that are not. And I mean that not in the rhetoric, but in their actual work and what they support, what they fund, how they make decisions. And we've seen amazing work at certain times where there's a window of opportunity. The network is there, the researchers, the communities, the practitioners are there. And I think one of the powerful things that I've seen in New York that has over 2,000 environmental stewardship organizations, some incredible leadership from a number of diverse communities, is that they're constantly working. And yes, we're losing funding. It's kind of it's a depressing time to get on Zoom calls with folks, but at the same time, we're maintaining connections. And I think you're seeing this in a lot of places. I was on a call in the last couple of weeks, been on calls with environmental justice organizations in Atlanta and South Atlanta, in New Orleans, and trying to understand where they're at and how we can provide technical assistance. But mostly what we're doing is staying connected, encouraging each other to stay the course, to keep working, so that when we have these opportunities that do open up, we can really mobilize ourselves and the resources that we have and work on them. So I think that's one angle. And another is, and this is the part that I think is more similar to the response to Alex, is to try to understand what are the motivators of whoever's in power, and are there ways that we can work within that context to argue for what we're really trying to work on. In the budget office in New York City, and even with very different mayors, the cost benefit approach is the way decisions are made. And so, kind of back to what we were talking about, Alex, there are some real challenges of arguing for investments in nature when the long-term, annual tax benefit from some other investment is going to be higher in terms of easily measured benefits to the city, right? If you build a building versus a pocket park, what is the city going to receive in direct revenue next year, the year after, the year after that? We really have to build up the case for the value of benefits for nearby neighborhoods, for stormwater regulation, for cooling, for reduced cooling cost of adjacent buildings, for the importance of attracting people to those areas because they see them as places for recreation, for benefits, for mental health, for ways that increase the even in some of these arguments you won't all like, but these are some of the arguments that sometimes need to be used. For example, including job performance, because stress, being able to look out your window at a green space reduces stress and anxiety, and this has been so well documented. So some of those arguments will work for some people, and some will need different ones. But I think, again, really starting to think about how to tailor messages and the sort of pitches or approaches in a way that can capture the attention within whatever the sort of dominant paradigm there is another of the strategies that we can kind of work on. In the US context, I think there's so much that's moving around, and depending on where you live or what you're working on, we'll have slightly different answers. So this is the kind of thing we could switch this conversation entirely and say, okay, everybody say what you're going to work on and what you think is going to be most effective, and we might all learn from each other. So I think these kinds of environments where we're getting presentations, discussions are great, but peer learning networks where we can actually, have a big question and we can all contribute to that in a more sort of equitable way across the screen here, we'll all learn from that. So I would just encourage folks as well is to reach out and ask these questions, less of me than of people that you're working with in your neighborhood or community, so we can together sort of strategize around what we think might be most effective in our neighborhood or in our city or in our state. We could say more about other contexts, but I guess I would just say that there's, depending on where you are in the world, it's very different, right? The passing of the EU, I mentioned the EU restoration law in the EU context is a really important change, right? It's going to mobilize funding. It's going to do a lot of things that just shows you the power of how legislation can be important. And we've seen that in New York with Local Law 97 and some of the other local laws that are mobilizing investments because communities have come together, advocates have come together and have really pushed for top-down, legal pushes to make change. And so again, there's many avenues, but certainly that's one of them as well.
Thank you so much. I do not see a question at the moment, but I had a question, maybe / proposal, which is if you would like to go back to the slides about the 5 key insights or the pathways, and if you want to expand on those, I'm sure everybody would be delighted to hear more.
You might be really optimistic about our audience patience with more slides.
I don't know. I really enjoyed those, and
I reopened them. I already shut them down. I was like, okay, that was a
sorry.
lot of slides.
That's helpful.
I'm pretty sure everybody loved it.
Marta, I just wanted to see, did you mean these?
If
The
you
ones
want,
I skipped?
yeah, you mentioned that
Yeah.
you might go back later.
It was just a slightly deeper dive into some points that I had said a little bit fast. This was coming out of this global analysis where we were seeing across all 7 regions of the world, and this this assessment that we were doing. And this is sort of like a pre-version of the global roadmap, which we'll be launching later this summer. So this is a sort of early paper version that actually generated the idea that we need to do a full assessment. So this was kind of the start of it. And one of the things that we found was that some parts of the world articulate this much more clearly, right? You see a lot of this coming out of, for example, New Zealand contexts, out of Latin American contexts, some in North American contexts, but the argument that leveraging indigenous, local, traditional, practical knowledge has incredible potential to really make nature-based solutions effective, because that local context knowledge is so important. What works here won't work everywhere, as one of my colleagues, Loan Dieppe, has said in one of her recent papers. And that's important not only to recognize, but then to say, so what will work here? And who knows? Who has that knowledge? And how do we really invest, hold that up, give it not just respect, but the opportunity to be a driver and be involved and even leading decision making in those cases. The other, and I left this out, this is really for a different talk, but this is coming out of this assessment as well, is that technology is changing. And there's an incredible role for us to harness technology as part of investing in nature-based solutions. And there's a lot of things here. One, you could imagine, and I'll just like throw out some ideas here, right? One of the ideas I've been floating, and I'm sure someone is going to create this soon, or it'll be the kind of thing we just learn how to ask other LLMs for, but training, whether it's generative AI or LLMs or others types of tools, to learn from every single sustainability, resilience, green infrastructure, biodiversity plan that's ever been written. And then to stratify that based on social context, ecological context, so that we can ask, okay, this is the complexity of things that I'm dealing with in my neighborhood. What has already been innovated? What are the ideas already there? So earlier I said, let's get in our networks and do this. But we should be increasingly be able to use tools to help give us a starting point for those answers. And I'm not to say this is just going to give you your plan, but it certainly can help us move a little faster on the state of knowledge that's out there in the world. So I think there's those kinds of tools. And then there's just recognizing that, whether it's automated watering systems or sensors or other investments in technology can be really important for making sure that the investments that we make can work. Green walls have to be watered a lot, right? They easily dry out. Green roofs as well. Food forests need their own management. We have to think about not only the human impact, but non-human impact. We have to think about the adjacent structures and other kinds of things. We have to think about how climate is changing. So there's a role for, I think, technology, digital infrastructure, and other things that can be useful there. And the other thing I'd say is kind of, if you put all this together, it's really sort of summary point to say that one of the ways I often talk about resilience when I give sort of talks on resilience is like one of the hallmarks of resilience is diversity, right? What allows for resilience? It's one of the fundamental aspects of that is that you need diversity, you need redundancy in systems. You can't focus highly on efficiency, and I mention that because we need that if we're going to have successful nature-based solutions, right? And by success, I mean ones that are effective, that last over the long time, that don't have the unintended consequences we see in some cases, that meet our goals for equity, but also for perhaps climate adaptation, perhaps for habitat for non-human species. And so that means engaging with diversity, diverse knowledges, diverse approaches, et cetera. So that's the longer version of this pathway one that we've kind of put forward. And the last one, and then I really will stop, Marta, is the systems approach. I think I covered quite a bit, but the idea here is really to think about the ways in which, when we think about urban systems, that we will recognize just how integrated they are, and that to deal with that level of integration, complicatedness, but even complexity, means we need to really think about the interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary approaches to not just knowledge production or learning, but actually our implementation approaches. So how do we do this in the context of really a complicated place? And I like Alex's example. I'm sure there's others on the call who have great examples they're working on as well, that are thinking of their core focus as connecting to many things that are happening in the system around them, and how they can support that. So there's a lot of knowledge synthesis still to do, a lot of learning from each other still to do, but I will leave it there. And thanks for the chance to go back to that, Marta. I appreciate it.
Thank you. We have one additional question, if you don't mind. Simone, would you like to ask your question in person? Otherwise, I'm happy to read it for you. Simone is asking, in light of the growing disconnection from nature, oh, okay, I'm gonna read it. From nature illustrated in Human Health disconnect slide, where modern lifestyles and screen time seem to dominate children's attention, and the compelling evidence in the MBS tree slide showing the multifaceted benefits of urban trees, how can we more effectively integrate MBS into urban planning in a way that not only addresses climate resilience and biodiversity, but also rekindles a personal psychological connection to nature for urban residents, especially youth? Thank you, Simone.
Thank you, Simone. Great question. Really important. I have 2 teenage kids. I think a lot about this generation that's coming up, and what the world is not only going to be like for them, but how they will change the world, which for me means a lot about who are these people going to be. And it I think is really important for us to do our work, whether you're a parent or not a parent, but as folks who have more agency in the world at the moment than our teens do, but soon they will, very, very soon, and even the kids that are younger, to invest in a world where their respect for, understanding, connection to nature can be enhanced. And I think youth is an incredible place to focus. So there's a number of things that are we could throw out here. One, right? How do we connect the education system in a way that can be involving kids in getting into nature in various ways? I remember in be a slightly longer answer. I'm going to give you a quick story. In 2008 and 2009, was working with New York City on the Million Trees program. This was like the beginning of Million Trees plans, right? And then mayors all around, the US and then all around the world sort of got into these competitions who can plant the most trees. But at the beginning of it, it was really kind of exciting. And we were planting trees in Queens with a number of community members, and the parents came out with their children. And one of the young boys who was sort of teaching like how to plant a tree, and we put the shovel in the ground and we're digging this hole, and he saw a worm for the first time in his life. Didn't know what it was, right? Maybe some of you have this experience, I don't know. But for me, who grew up on a farm in the Midwest of the country, it was shocking. I just hadn't quite wrapped my head around the idea that urban dwellers might not know what a worm is and have never seen one. And second, that it was so exciting to be able to be part of this first experience, this like amazing first experience with a certain part of nature, and in the context of planting trees and helping to kind of green up this neighborhood. And it just sort of really helped me. And I go back to this as a memory a lot to remind me that this will happen more and more if we don't redesign our city. So I think there's a role in the education system. There's a role in community groups and community organizations that can involve youth in their programs to create youth programming and to really program our green spaces. So we don't necessarily talk about that, though I know some of you are for sure working on this, but to really think about youth programming in a way that puts them out in nature, whether it's on a weekly basis or dedicated experiences on weekends or over the summers when they're out of school. But there's a lot of great work that's happening there, and I think a lot more to do. We were talking about food a little earlier, and I think there's some really amazing movements, whether you go back to Michelle Obama's initiatives or even previous to that, other initiatives that have been really trying to create places where kids can grow food at their schools, even if it's just carrots, right? The whole point is that they're learning not only about where food comes from, but in the process of learning about that, they're learning about certain parts of nature, and hopefully that can engender their excitement around learning about others. So I just think there's an incredible opportunity there to invest in the youth and the young generation, and think about that fact that if the majority of humans are growing up in cities, what our cities are like and their connection to nature in cities is the dominant connection to nature they'll have, right?
Thank you so much, Timon, for these thoughtful words. If there are no further questions, I think we're going to wrap up here. But I would like to thank you very much, Timon, for contributing to the Sustainable Solution Lecture Series and for contributing to this community. And hopefully this conversation will continue also next year. This is our fourth talk of the Sustainable Lecture Series, and we are going to have one more talk in May. I will send a notification to all those of you who expressed interest in being in our mailing list. And I hope we're going to be in touch, and we will be able to share additional resources in the future, and maybe have you as a speaker in the future as well. I'm sure.
Thank you so much, Marta. Really appreciate being here, and great questions and discussion, folks. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And bye-bye, everybody.
Take care.
Bye.